Hey everyone, I'm Boo.
And I'm Spice, and this is a very unique episode of Boom and Spice Book Advice. The first time we've ever had a remote guest on, and the first interview we've ever conducted on the podcast. Typically, it's just having people come on and read their stuff, but
Yep.
no, it's very very interesting change of pace. His name is Ryan Nanni. He is the former managing editor of Secret Base, and he's the co-host of the Shutdown Fullcast podcast. It's a college football podcast. It's very popular. I didn't realize how many people I knew actually listened to that podcast before I started mentioning you. It's
Do
it's
you
very
feel differently
interesting.
about them now?
No, I think I think differently about you now. Now that I know the kind of listener base you have, I don't know.
That's fair. I guess this door does swing both ways.
Ryan, can you explain the little project you're doing this year? Your New Year's resolution?
Sure. Because I'm a very stupid man, I decided that this year I would try to appear as a guest on as many podcasts as would have me. My reasoning behind this is that being a guest on podcasts is fun. It's pretty low stress. Like, I've compared it so far to staying in a hotel room because you don't have to clean everything up, or going to a dinner party because you're not responsible for all of the setup. And I'm having a great time doing it. It's something I think my wife is curious about my choices in this pursuit, but so far she hasn't yelled at me about it. So
That's
far, so
fantastic.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it being easier on your end with the the setting up and editing part of it. You introduced us to this Riverside thing.
Which
Before-
I only knew about by doing this. Like this,
Yeah.
I only knew about by other podcasts having me record this way. So see, I've already helped in some
Oh,
way
heck
through
yeah.
this project. So
Immensely.
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, we've taken great strides in the past 6 hours. We didn't own headphones before this.
There you
We just
go.
sort of were recording on our mic. Far more professional now.
You're in on a big operation here.
I'm happy. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to help.
This is the lowest stress podcast you're ever going to be on. So, you mentioned that you were an English major in college, right?
Yeah.
So, how long has it been since you've had to, write formally about the things you read?
Oh gosh. I mean, I guess that kind of describes a little bit of what being a lawyer is, just that the things you read are court cases or thousands of emails from corporate inboxes or something like that. But if you're talking about literary analysis, which being a lawyer definitely is not, and that was made very clear to me, we're talking 15 years at this point, 16, a long time. The time it's been since I was doing that with any regularity, a child has been born and acquired a driver's license since then, which makes me feel good.
Yeah. And you've been very successful since then. I'm very impressed that you got back to me so quick. I kind of assumed that you were getting bombarded with podcast emails. I was very surprised how quickly you got back to me.
I respond in, other people will tell you, I respond in fits and starts. Like, it is the kind of thing where I have to sit down and say, I'm going to respond to podcast emails today, and I'll hit 15 people back, because otherwise it will be, oh no, I let this email go unresponded to for 3 weeks and I feel like a jerk about it.
I'll catch that every once in a while. I'll have fellow students, because I'm still in college and so is Boom, and I'll have fellow students email me like, "Hey, did you get the notes for this class?" And it's been 3 days, and it's like, these won't help you now.
Like, if it's that important, you should have texted me. You should have reached out a different way.
Yeah,
That's all there is to it.
yeah, like the snail mail of our generation.
Yes,
Like,
yes, exactly. Yeah, it would be like if in the 90s, if you had been like, "Oh, this is important. I'm going to send this person." No, call them. That's what you would have done.
Exactly. So, for your job or for your work at Secret Base, how much reading did you do? Because I remember specifically the the beef history episode with Ray Allen and Rajon Rondo.
Yeah.
I picked up the Ray Allen autobiography, like the memoir, specifically because of that episode.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think the answer varies a lot depending on the topic and your familiarity with it, and also just like where the material is. For some stuff, you can find a lot of what you're looking for through existing internet resources. A resource I really love is called newspapers.com, which is just this huge archive of old newspapers going back, I think, as far as maybe into like the early 1900s. Less useful for like NBA beefs, but still potentially interesting. And the book thing is not something that I necessarily did a lot of, but our team, Seth Rosenthal especially, like, got really good at figuring out like, this is where you need to go to get the level of detail that you don't necessarily get from a blog or something like that. But I still like to pick up sports books of that ilk, either just for like my own interest and edification, or because I think there is something about sports books versus sports blogging or sports journalism that is a little more. It's just a different way for your brain to think about this thing that you spend so much time watching and thinking about. It really like adds some structure narratively and from a character perspective as well that can kind of get lost in the day to day, I think.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And I mean, we're both high school and now some of us college athletes, so it's definitely something that you can totally lose just watching it every Saturday, like what people are actually getting to go through, what their story's like, what
Yeah.
motivates them. So that's definitely a cool piece. I don't know if I've read any actual sports books, but
I think
that's intriguing.
I think what I like about them is, sports, the way sports are covered is so much about what just happened or what's going to happen. Like recaps and previews. And that's just because sports are on constantly, and what matters in a lowercase m sense is like, did you just win or not? Like ultimately, that's like what is capturing our attention. But the interesting things are frequently the things that we don't get to talk about until after the dust has settled. Like, I think David Halberstam, who was just a fantastic uh, uh, scribe of sports stories, captured that because he could tell you about, like Bill Walton winning a championship with the Portland Trailblazers, a thing that I wasn't alive for and that I don't remember. But when you have the advantage of sort of not having to sort of just say like, this story has to get out and it has to tell you what happened 8 hours ago, 3 hours ago, 10 minutes ago, you really get to add a lot more, not just sort of like flavor to it, but you add a lot more perspective, I think, because when you go and talk to people and when you kind of see like the arc of something, you gain a deeper appreciation for what a moment meant, what a relationship actually looked like, what was important and what wasn't. Those answers change, I think, drastically the more space and time you have to step back from them.
And on that notion, or to that notion, do you think there's a specific athlete that you found that whose character arc or whose arc as a player has specifically brought you in, like enthralled you a bit?
Gosh. I don't know I don't know that I could point to one and say like that person sort of got me where I'm at today. The nice thing is that I sort of like jump around a lot. I think like Hideo Nomo for some reason has really been bouncing around my head over the last few months. Like, and that really started from remembering, how big a deal it was to have a player at that point. This is right after the MLB strike in the mid 90s, leave Japanese baseball and come to America to play here professionally. There's a really good 30 for 30 podcast episode about this that explains that more or less Hideo Nomo had to trick his current team into letting him retire so that was the only way you could leave Japanese baseball and come to America. It hadn't been done in something like 50 years. And the success of that paved the way for so many super talented modern Japanese baseball players, and really was this turning point not just for one person but for an entire sport and a sport across two countries. So I that has been one that sort of grabbed me, but it kind of moves around. Like, the nice thing I think about sports are that what appeals to me about them narratively is that aside from all the superhuman things that the athletes are doing on the field, it's all incredibly human stuff. It all has to do with, competition in ways that are just like about natural friction between people, or about overcoming feelings of inadequacy, or about how learning to work with coworkers that you don't like very much, or having to make big changes to see positive results. And all of these things that ultimately are not in any way restricted to sports as a field, they're just sort of amplified and maybe refracted a little bit.
Have you seen parallels between that and the literature you were working with when you were getting your degree? 'Cause there's that whole school of thought with like man versus nature, man versus self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's interesting. And so for context, a lot of what, I think like most English majors, what I studied sort of was all over the map. But towards the end of my undergraduate career, I took a seminar on Sylvia Plath, and I took another seminar on. We brought up Dracula, but sort of like Dracula, Frankenstein, that whole period of sort of. I think romance novels is what they were called, with not the same romance that we apply to them now. And I don't know how Sylvia Plath necessarily applies to sports. I suspect that there's probably some interest. There are probably some parallels there in terms of power dynamics for sure, and about one thing that's changed a lot in the last 20 years in American sports, at least, is the relative role of player to coach to owner. These are roles that had very strict definitions and very strict understandings that players chafed against. It's not exactly the same thing as some of the topics that come up in Sylvia Plath's poetry, but I think there are some interesting parallels there for sure. And then with something like Dracula or Frankenstein, it's interesting. I this is the most Florida thing I could possibly say right now. I had floated writing a thesis about Dracula and emerging germ theory, and about how these things roughly lined up on a timeline, and how they may be how maybe germ theory influenced Dracula as a piece of literature. The Florida part of this is that the professor that I had reached out to about this never got back to me, because it turned out that he was in the middle of getting investigated for now the word totally escapes me, when you're stealing material from other places.
Embezzlement? I don't.
No. He was lifting. This is
plagiarism?
Yes, plagiarism.
Yeah,
That's the word. That's the word. He was dealing with a major plagiarism scandal, so he didn't get back to me in the first place. But I say that because I think to the extent Frankenstein, for instance, is about what does science mean in the modern world, and what are the limits of it, and how, what does it mean to be human? Dracula has some of the same applications as well. those are not too different from some of the debates we have about, performance enhancing drugs in sports, and where do we draw the line between what is a normal amount of foreign substance to put in your body and a non-normal amount. Yeah, I don't know that I have necessarily thought about these direct parallels. I will say this, now I'm going to stop rambling after this, I promise.
That's all right.
I think literary analysis taught me a lot about taking something and trying to look for alternative angles on it. Taking a piece of text and sort of saying, like, okay, what are the different ways that you can sort of turn this like a kaleidoscope and unpack it? And I think it's really helpful when you're trying to write about something like sports or anything in sort of like modern culture to have that same attitude, because ultimately, like, you can just write a straight, here's what happened in this game, here's sort of the narrative that I know I'm supposed to sort of lay out. But I think so much of the interesting work and so much of the work that really resonates with people does take it through a really alternative viewpoint that is still, like, based on the same underlying thing that you're working with.
Do you think that sort of that school of thought where you're looking at players from a variety of perspectives and trying to not look at in the sort of like black and white box score kind of way, do you think that has been more driven by you and your ilk, or has that been a move that media in sports at large has taken on?
It's probably multifaceted at this point. I think a lot of it, frankly, in the last few years has been driven by how much athletes themselves want to influence and be a part of their own narrative. Like, I don't think people, depending on how old you are, like you two, maybe don't have any strong recollection of how extremely private or, media limited our biggest athletes were for a long, long time. Like, Michael Jordan was not out here. There was no Instagram for Michael Jordan to go on. There was no television show. He would maybe make an appearance on, like, David Letterman or something like that, and he'd get interviewed after a game, and maybe they do one of those pre-taped sit-down things. But what people knew or didn't know about players or how they thought about players was largely influenced by the media, because that's the only side of the story you got. And even, players themselves had to sort of go through the media as a gatekeeper of sorts to have their perspective be shared. Allen Iverson is a really good example of this, of somebody who, like, was portrayed in one way, and there was not a lot of room for alternative viewpoint from him or from other people, because the structure just wasn't in place. So I think as the pathways to disseminating opinion and information and perspective have expanded and to some extent democratized, you've seen, there is sort of like the blogger guard, or, whatever, the alternative media, maybe you want to call it, that has brought that perspective. A lot of independent creators do this as well. But just as importantly is, like, the fact that, how many NBA players have their own podcast at this point, which functionally is like having their own radio show 20 years ago, which was not a thing that happened.
That's really interesting. I was thinking about specifically like JJ Redick recently with
Sure.
him and Kendrick Perkins,
Yeah.
where it's like super personal topics, very innate sort of like identity issues being handled in front of millions of people at the time, and then, in perpetuity, exists on the internet forever.
Right.
And I wonder if, in some ways, thinking about it like that, and then sort of back to that Frankenstein idea, whether or not that it's gone a little too far. Because that feels like the sort of thing, like if they were in the same room at the time, that's something you might fight about.
Mm-hmm.
Is, like, you've got JJ calling into question whether or not bringing up race with Nikola Jokic's MVP race is valid, and then Kendrick Perkins taking it personally, understandably so, because he feels as though he's looking from it from an analytical rather than biased perspective. And I guess the question is, do you think that it has potentially gone too far in terms of how much of a leash players are given, or do you think this is just where the status quo should be?
What I suspect has happened, and this is my answer to most things about like, is there too much? Has the internet made us all like worse and angrier and more demonstrably assholish? My suspicion is that most people that hasn't like changed. It's just made it all much more public. Like I think these are the kind of conversations or discussions that probably happened before, you had two former players on an ESPN show like this, but they happened behind closed doors or in a locker room or at a restaurant, whatever it is. And I guess the question is sort of, is there's value to sort of like bringing that out into public view? Ultimately, I think it depends on sort of like what happens next. I think, broadly speaking, players, current and former, bringing their perspective on issues in sports is a net positive because it's just a perspective that has been undercovered and underpresented or presented in a very specific, repetitive way for so long that it sort of needs that room to breathe. Does it sometimes veer into the overly personal or the hot takey? Sure, but like, frankly, sports media would do that without them. It just would be, two media commentators doing it instead of two former players.
Do you think that as time goes by, it'll become more cultivated rather than how scattershot it is right now? 'Cause you get like Jean Morant, flashing a gun at the strip club,
Yep.
or Myers Leonard saying anti-Semitic slurs on
On
Twitch
Twitch,
streams.
yeah.
Yep, exactly.
How do you mean it will get more explain to me more about what you're thinking so I don't give you a bad answer, or at least give you a structured bad answer.
So I'm of two minds on it, where it's either from the team, because obviously, especially with the Grizzlies situation, they're going to get in Ja Morant's ear.
Yep.
Whether or not he listens or not is a question, but they're going to have to. Otherwise, it's going to wind up maybe even getting him in prison at this point.
Yeah.
'Cause he's really veering into some real crazy lines.
Yep.
Or if players themselves would take the onus, like LeBron very seldom has a controversy, and even when he does, it's more so like systematic. Like, yeah, it's a controversy that involves LeBron, but it's a controversy of the entire NBA.
Right.
Where I guess it's a question of, do you think teams will tighten that leash themselves, and do you think players might take the initiative to try and police themselves on that?
I think players probably already do. Like, I think for years this has been the case where, teams as a collection of players, not necessarily as a management group down, like try to sort of self-correct or self-police to some extent, because that's sort of the culture of team sports, is the idea that you have your older set that helps sort of teach your younger, newer, maybe wilder group how to conduct themselves. Now, a lot of that sort of depends on everybody, having a group involved that can sort of set the right tone and give the right sort of message. And ultimately, I think that can be successful because most of us are more receptive to hearing that message from peers that we respect and from communities that we feel a part of than from being punished by the outside, being lambasted by the media. I think if you are John Morant, you probably are more likely to take it to heart if your teammates feel like you've let them down rather than if Skip Bayless is screaming about you on television. I think it's easier to write the latter off. The thing, whether teams or leagues will do this, I mean, to some extent, these things have already happened, and the problem is that they're not great at it because you end up putting them into, this is now more of, I guess, me putting the legal hat on than the English major hat on. You're putting them into quasi-legal enforcement positions, which, whether or not you think their intentions are good, they just tend to be bad at, because the questions of, do we want consistent precedents here? Do we want to treat each case differently? What is, the standard of review that we're using? Really complicated things that go into how you adjudicate whether or not people have crossed an ethical line. They don't seem very skilled at, and their answers are mostly, we're going to fine you, or we're going to prevent you from playing for some period of time. So yeah, I mean, I guess to use one example of that, Kyrie Irving and his whole saga, most recent, because they're 8 or so, with the Nets and sharing anti-Semitic content and, all of that. At no point did that feel like, oh, okay, this is a structured situation where somebody is dealing with a group that they can and will take feedback from in a meaningful way. That might be specific to Kyrie Irving, though, frankly. So
it's really interesting to think about how over time they're going to have to consider the precedent caused by something like this, where it's like Kyrie was given so much leeway in that situation. When you're also counting into the fact the whole vaccine situation and that they were real touch and go with his punishments, I wonder how the Nets could ever justify a consistent form of punishment from here on out when people look at that that disaster that went on in their organization.
I mean, these are the tricky things about sport. Sports are really good about saying, here's what is okay and not okay on the field, on the court, because you can write those rules with a level of specificity where even if you don't necessarily agree with how the determinations are made or whether they're consistent, you can make the rule itself very clear. You cannot take this many steps. You have to get 2 feet down in bounds, etc., etc. But what do you do? How do you sort of write a rule that says you can protest the national anthem if you are doing it for this political reason, but if, I don't know, let's use an example and say Ennis Freedom was back in the league and Joe Biden came to a game and Ennis Freedom decides he's not going to be out there for the national anthem because he thinks Joe Biden not falsely elected president. What do you do now? Are we saying, this is where you get into all these sort of gray areas, and I don't think leagues are well equipped to sort of deal with the fuzzy areas that get into sort of not free speech, because it's not the First Amendment as the First Amendment is written, but speech issues. John Morant is a different category, obviously. But yeah, I mostly I wonder if any of these leagues actually want to be involved with any of this, because they seem so bad at it and they never seem confident with the decisions they're making in these regards.
There's a bit of a parallel to some of the issues lately with authors, which Boom and I have discussed on the podcast a bit, where we've got a flat out ban on J.K. Rowling's material.
Yep.
Merely because it in terms of the risk she poses to the trans community, it really it makes it unconscionable to cover her in any sort of depth. And I wonder if we get, or if sports media in general could get into a situation like Death of the Author, where you're like, I want to actively ignore this person, and I want to focus on what they did out on the court. Like, J.K. Rowling, not, someone I want to associate with, but I'm going to have to grapple with her material if I want to cover, like, young adult fantasy novels of, the 2000s. And do you think that's happened? Like, maybe, like a Karl Malone situation or an O.J. Simpson, where they...
Yeah, I mean, those, to the extent that those examples maybe don't fit as well, I think I think those present different challenges, is what I should say, because the way the timing works, it becomes relatively easy for people to do that bifurcation, to sort of say, like, well, I'm talking about this player who did these things, and then separate from that, take O.J. Simpson. Like, O.J. Simpson, long retired, long done being a football player when he's prosecuted for murder and eventually goes to jail for robbery and this, that, and the other. But, like, sports is already, and I don't say this as a compliment, extremely good at moving on and compartmentalizing. Like, there is, and you can kind of watch it happen where, to take Deshaun Watson for one example, like, at some point, sports media says, okay, Deshaun Watson's clearly going to be allowed to keep playing football, and what do we do about that? We have to talk about the sort of bare bones sports of it. Do we need to lead every article about him with the fact that he's got X number of accusers lining up lawsuits against him, and that he has settled Y, whatever? And I don't think anybody ever really lands on a good answer, because, if you're an NFL reporter, some years you can do this because some years they stink, but you can't just pretend the Cleveland Browns don't exist when they signed Deshaun Watson. And if they're good, you really can't pretend they don't exist. I don't think sports has at all figured it out. But I appreciate that there appears to be more of an honest effort to do so, at least going forward. And I don't know. I mean, I don't have a good answer to this one, because I think there are probably larger societal struggles we have with this as well, that sports media just happens to, again, like, amplify and refract in some ways.
You're going to say something, Boom?
No. Just taking it in.
I find it fascinating, that idea of opening articles with that sort of asterisk. Like, this is Deshaun Watson, and this is what he's done lately, and here's how he settled. Because we do that often, like, even on this podcast, where we were covering, Flannery O'Connor? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, like, we were talking about some of her Southern Gothic, and, like, I ran into a short story where it was just littered with the N-word. And I had to grapple with whether or not Flannery O'Connor was legitimately racist, or if she was just of her time, or of her geography, or a mix of both. It's funny, Boom and I were doing some research. First article that comes up when you look up, is Flannery O'Connor racist? It's, how racist was Flannery O'Connor? They kind of answered my question right away.
Yeah.
Sort of cut to the quick. So it was really it's really interesting thinking about how you need to handle active people, because, like, Flannery O'Connor's dead, H.P. Lovecraft's dead, a lot of these authors.
Norman Mailer is dead.
Yeah, and it makes for a really difficult conversation still to contextualize these things.
Here's my question for you. The thing that is different in the literary space is that the work itself is re-examined. Like, Roald Dahl is the recent example of what's going on in that space, or at least one of. That's a thing that doesn't happen in sports. Nobody really goes back and says, like, well, we should rethink about these Jazz Bulls NBA Finals in light of everything John Stockton said about this, that, or, whatever. Like, that to me seems like a really tricky challenge in the literary space where you sort of, even when somebody, the person is gone, the work gets re-examined and in some cases changed to try to reflect, I guess, improved sensibilities is the most diplomatic way I can put it.
It's fascinating because we do a lot with fantasy because Boom's favorite genre is fantasy, and we sort of go back and forth on that. And fantasy and sci-fi are next of kin, and existential horror is a branch of that sci-fi sort of area. And H.P. Lovecraft, if you're going to talk about existential horror, you need to discuss H.P. Lovecraft. And he was a horrible racist. And unlike some other authors who may have been racist, but it doesn't really impact their work because they write in the abstract. They write without real societal implications. With him, it's central to a lot of his work, like the Shadow over Innsmouth. That one in particular, they discuss race quite a bit for a story about fish people. Just sort of about being descended by an ancient from an ancient group of fish people. And with us, I think it's something you need to attack head on because it's not going to change unless you change it. Like with sports, it's very objective. There's nothing you can do with Karl Malone's box score to change what he did and how he performed.
Yep.
But with Lovecraft, you can front it and be like, all right, here is exactly where he's racist in this story. I don't want you to either absorb it subconsciously or think it's okay by proxy because he's a respected author.
Yeah.
And then you can sort of progress a little bit through that work. So that's how we've handled it. Where if it does come up, we try and head it up in the past and try and avoid falling into the trap of just ignoring it, because
sure.
then you're sort of normalizing it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that is, to me, that has always been the tricky part about doing this on the sports side, is that ignoring it is the wrong answer, because then you are sort of tacitly letting it slide. But it does feel like it is important to sort of like make it an opening of sorts, make it a place where you can sort of provide context or open up an area for conversation, rather than just sort of like, to me it's just as unhelpful to sort of like get your content warning out there and then move on and not have any sort of like actual engagement with the thing.
That is a really interesting point. So I think it would be really difficult if you just went, all right, H.P. Lovecraft was a racist. Like he named his cat the N-word. Just crazy racist nonsense. And to go, all right, here's this trigger warning. This guy was a racist. Now let's
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's happened quite a few times, especially with our first season of the podcast. We haven't covered anybody living yet, so a lot of these books have been written a long time ago. So taking that lens of like, well, at the time it was written, what was the world like? Is it progressive then compared to today's lens? And like, if it wasn't, if it is, like, just actually digging into that material instead.
Sure.
Just so you know, like, this guy was a bad guy.
Right.
Let's jump in.
Right.
You want to tell them about that situation with Frankenstein?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Geez. I don't know if you were mentioning that you were writing about it or looking into it in a class, and we were reading Frankenstein and we brought it up on our first episode, at some point in that book, they're talking about South America, and just the way that Mary Shelley phrased it, she's like, "Well, there's no people there." Like just saying, like, as if, like, I don't know. That's all the context she gives. It's just
Right.
there's no people on South
Right.
America, so
Right.
at least you can't terrorize it. It's like,
Right. It's like, are you thinking of Antarctica? Is that what you meant?
yeah, or is it? Yeah,
And it got to the point where we're like, she's pretty learned. There's a lot of stuff here that, like, she's clearly not an idiot. So it's either she doesn't realize, like, there's some sort of cultural issue here where she doesn't realize people live there.
Yeah.
Or even worse, she doesn't think South
Doesn't see
American
them as
people are
people.
people. Exactly.
Right.
That's-
Yeah. Yeah.
wild stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, what do you do with that? You know?
Yeah, it's like if I heard someone say that on the street and then, I'm delving into it, it's like, Jesus, man, like, there's no saving that.
Right.
But now, yeah,
But
she
if you
can't
heard,
argue.
But if you heard somebody say, like, I don't know, just drop Frankenstein's monster in Wyoming. Nobody lives there. Like, I could see someone saying that. It's just as wrong. It's just as, like, factually incorrect. Yeah. It's
That is a funny point.
Yeah.
I didn't consider.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's nice to think about maybe just like population density.
Yeah.
There aren't many people there.
Well, that's the
whereas
tricky
they're
part about this
thinking-
is that this is both the good and the bad part about literary analysis is that there's a read of that where it's just like, okay, if you are part of the salon class European structure, like you think of big cities, places where lots of people live. And so maybe it's just a comparative thing where, like, well, there are no big cities from my perspective in South America, so functionally nobody lives there. And it's not a race thing. It's the same thing you might have said about big swaths of North America at that point. Maybe it's a class thing. I don't know. Like, that's the fun part, is there's so many bad strands you can pull out of this.
I just wish she had been, like, deliberate. Like, send him to
Yes.
South America.
Yes.
It's sparsely
Yes.
populated. You
Yes.
live in a cottage in the woods.
Yes,
Not,
yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
no one
Or if
lives
she
there.
had said, like, the rainforest, been like, okay, that's like a
Yeah,
relatively
wilderness
understood.
area,
Yeah, I get it. Yeah. A whole continent to say nobody lives there is more of a stretch. Yes.
Pretty crazy generalization.
Yeah.
I enjoyed when I was reading your email and you mentioned the books you had read. We just finished the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird, and it was called Go Set a Watchman, and it brings up a lot of these issues in terms of just its release, not even getting into the content, where she was very old when it was released, and even now it's coming up on public domain anyway, so eventually there was a chance it would have seen the light of day. And whether or not she had the autonomy to release it or not, like whether she was in the right headspace, was an issue that Boom and I had discussed. And I think it brings up another issue of context where it's not only the things in the book, it's everything surrounding the book. In this case, who knows how much editing she could do when she was 88 and on her deathbed,
Yeah, and even in the on the back of the book where it's talking about the writer, it's like this book was written in 19 whenever it was written. I forget the exact year.
Like
but-
65 or
yeah,
something.
like a long time ago, and it
Yeah.
says like it was just published now. Like
Yeah.
it didn't leave any explanation about like it was an unfinished project that she didn't mean to put out, and now for some reason is being published. For we're not saying why, just want to milk that, get more money out of it.
Yeah.
Finish the story or what, they don't say. And now at this point she is like really old. I mean, like it's hard to tell whether it's her intent to have it out, whether what's in there is what she wanted to be in there at the time of writing it, if she remembered the story.
Mm-hmm.
It's all just really, really hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, I guess, like, the thing that links maybe talking about athletes and authors or artists of any sorts, this because these are all just various forms of performance, is the very hard question of like how much you tie the creator to the creation. And I don't like that gets asked in a lot of, J.K. Rowling is probably the best contemporary example of like, can you separate art from artists, or should you, et cetera, et cetera. But even beyond sort of, the thornier ethical questions, like these are the questions, I don't know. I remember these are the questions you sort of grapple with just doing straight literary analysis. Just sort of like, how much should I read? How much can I read into this from that has to do with, the author themselves? How much is the work separate from the author? How much of it depends on their intent for it to be so? And ultimately, these are not questions that have, this isn't chemistry. These don't have firm answers to them. That's part of what makes the process interesting and invigorating and capable of going in multiple directions at the same time. But when it does get into the kind of areas you're talking about, and especially with, an author who, for To Kill a Mockingbird, for years, just the rumors of she didn't write this and, all of that sort of layered on top of it. Yeah, it's, I understand why people want sports and art to be an escape from having to deal with all of these real world problems. But ultimately, I think that has to be futile. Like, if Go Set a Watchman is mired in questions of, how do we treat the elderly? What rights do they have? How much should we, how much should we make decisions for them, depending on their capacity, et cetera, et cetera? Like, those are questions we have to deal with out in the real world, too. It's not just about this book. And I think it's probably healthier and more useful to apply these lessons and to think about these things outside of their context as broad. Like, every question we're asking about J.K. Rowling is really not about, like, what do we do with this one lady? What do we do with this one author? It's more about, like, what do we want the discourse about trans people in society to be or to not be? It just happens to coincide with this hugely popular piece of IP,
Yeah, it's really interesting to try and take those issues and go more broadly with them, especially to try and avoid the sort of, like, people try and cut down those arguments where it's like, oh, she's just the wizard lady.
Yep.
Like, what harm could she be doing?
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you think where, right now we are in a medium that will exist, assuming YouTube doesn't go out of business, until the sun burns out.
Right.
And, like, you have such a large platform that I've been watching you for years, and you had no idea. Like, I've seen you in, like, potentially a dozen videos, if not more. You've been credited on even more.
Yeah.
I knew your name in passing. I mentioned you at work, and, like, 4 people knew who you were. And it's like, does that ever become a consideration of yours? Where it's like, what could my legacy be when I'm gone? How will this age?
Yes, but from a very different perspective. I guess I worry less about legacy from a big picture standpoint and more like, am I doing and saying things that I will feel good about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that my kids will feel positively about? Like, I don't need them all to think that it's interesting or funny or even smart, but I don't want to get in a position where, like, they're like, oh, that's some shameful shit that he said or didn't say. Like, I just don't want to be there. And I will acknowledge that it is tough because it requires sort of a constant checking in with oneself, and it requires humility is really what it is. I think if there's one thing I have learned doing this for as long as I have now, it's that you can't, like, it's very dangerous to get to a place where you feel like you are the smartest person in the room on the YouTube channel, on Twitter, whatever, and that you don't have anything to learn from other people. And being able to embrace that humility, I think, A, helps you listen more than you speak, or at least change the ratio so you're listening more than you might be otherwise. And B, helps you sort of self-examine the things that you think, the things that you say, the things that you want to put out there, in ways that are ultimately, hopefully, better for everyone. Because, you probably make more money and get a better audience doing the opposite of what I've just said, but I don't know that you'll best necessarily be personally happier with it.
It's interesting you bring that up, and it makes me think about, like, how long you've been thinking like that, how long you've been cognizant of how we'll age in terms of not necessarily the people's perception of you, but your own personal feelings on what you said. There's this video, I think you might have had a cameo in it, where it's like The Dumbest Boy Alive by John Boyce.
About the weightlifting forum.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's this point at the beginning where John's like, reading quotes from this forum, and the R word comes up.
Mm-hmm.
He takes the video to a full stop, halts it, and he says, "Hey, just so we're clear, I'm not going to say that word, and I don't think it's cool. It hurts people, and if you think it's cool, I think you should ask around." And it's neat to see something that, like in other contexts, someone might call that virtue signaling or something. But I think setting an example, like being the type of person where you look back and you might read a comment about that here and there. We won't, because we don't get comments too often unless they're spam bots. But like a comment here and there where it's like, "Hey, that was a cool thing you did in that video." And I was just wondering how long it took, or if this was always something you were cognizant of, that people's perception of you and your perception of yourself may be altered by things you say in the past on such a platform.
I guess I've always sort of had an understanding that people's perception of me can be altered equally by what I have said versus what I say versus what I will say. Like, that I understand. At the same time, I don't get bogged down in that, because ultimately, like, the way at least I work with the internet, the negative comments sit with me a lot harder and a lot longer than the positive comments do. I also know that very little, like, so much of this is, it would be like if you ran a newspaper based just on letters to the editor and just said, like, well, that's where our coverage should go. It'd be like, cool, so now you're responding just to your loudest and maybe most bored set of readers, and that's maybe not a good decision. Ultimately, I think the compass and sort of the weighing of this has to be internalized. You have to feel comfortable and good with the choices you're making. And I think, like, without remembering specifically any conversation I had with John about that, John is pretty good at that on his own. Like, I don't think John does a segment like that or avoids, unnecessary language or hateful perspectives or whatever because he's trying to sort of, like, send a signal out to the audience. I think he just is, like, trying to be a good person for his own sake. But I don't think I like got to the internal place right away. I think that had more to do with just sort of, like, figuring out why I wanted to do creative work and what the goal of it was. And that has probably shifted a lot more towards, I'm trying to do something for other people and I'm trying to do something that's for an audience, whatever that audience looks like, to I'm trying to do something that is good for me and makes that I'm happy about, and that will connect with people in a meaningful way. Like that's I think the biggest difference is there's attention and then there's connection, and those things are not the same thing. And you can get a lot of attention, but that is not the same process and not the same outcome as doing something that connects with other people on a human level.
I think with such a fluid medium like as, podcasting, where it's, consistently putting out material so often, or YouTubing, similar deal.
Yeah.
Where like you get so much more connection than like, to take it back to literary criticism. Like Boom and I love I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou and Boom and I were alive for the exact same time for like 20 years. Where like if we had read it back then and sent her an email or sent her a tweet or something,
yeah,
next to no chance she responds to it. She was like 70, 75 or something when we would have sent that. But, like it wouldn't have impacted her in a meaningful way. But with you having that content with an actual comment section underneath, like, does that impact the nature of your content, that you have such quick response times from your audience?
I guess it depends. That's a very lawyerly answer to give you, but like if it's a YouTube video, not really. I mean, on Secret Base, the thing that has been most interesting about the comment section there, at least while I was with the team, was that it became a really interesting place to go for creative ideas. Like the nice thing about creating, formats that can be iterated upon is people will come to you and say like, hey, I would love to see an episode about this. There's one commenter there who's constantly like spamming the channel. Spamming is an exaggeration, but leaving comments about Sir Donald Bradman, who was an Australian cricket player. Great cricketer. I don't know the word. And like because of that, I have learned more about this person that I had no reason to engage with. But like I am not at a point where like I really live and die by the commentary, the good or the bad. It's nice, the good is nice, but like frankly, having a conversation like this is much more personally invigorating because you get to sort of like get a sense of what the work means to somebody else, share what the work means to you as somebody who helped put it together in the first place. I think it's much more rewarding. And like with the podcast, when we were doing live shows, that was way more interesting and insightful and useful than just looking at comments, because ultimately, like, none of the art is for everyone. None of the things you create are for all people. They're, for everything that you make that 1,000 people like, 5,000 people won't like it. And that's fine. Like, ultimately, I don't think anyone's goal is to say, I want to make the one thing that everyone will love. If pizza isn't it, it's probably not going to be a YouTube video, so I'm not going to chase that impossibility, that's for sure.
It is interesting in that, like, Charlie, we wrestled together. I don't want to say his last name on the podcast to like dox him, but he and I work together now, and I brought up he's a huge sports guy, plans on coaching high school football when he gets the chance, and I mentioned you and I mentioned the opportunity this was. He's like, oh, the Shutdown Fullcast, and I'm like, no kidding, you actually listen to this guy's podcast? Because I'm not, ironically, I'm not a huge podcast guy in terms of the content I consume.
Yeah,
I'm more of the video essay kind of dude. So I wasn't sure what to expect in terms of responses, but like he was all about it. He was like, oh man, I listen to that guy's podcast all the time, and like Charlie, I joke, but he's like the most regular guy I know in terms of like you're not catching some weirdo who's like just all about sports. He's like a guy with regular hobbies and habits and stuff who just happens to listen to your podcast when he drives. Said, like, it's never mundane when I hear someone has listened to my podcast. Does it get mundane when someone talks about listening to yours?
Not really, no, because I think, like, I remain surprised and mostly delighted that people listen to the show at all. That is probably the biggest example of a thing I do that is kind of just for me, or for me and my co-hosts or whatever. We're like, it's awesome that we have people who listen to our show, and we're super appreciative that we do. But I think even the people who like it and listen to it, it would say like, oh, this is clearly not a thing they're doing because they're like pursuing a certain audience or trying to sort of like gain a foothold with people. We do it, and we're trying to make each other laugh, and we're trying to crack each other up, and other people enjoy it, and that rules, and that's great. So I'm not surprised. I guess I'm equally surprised anytime anyone tells me that they listen to the show. There isn't, like, you say Charlie's like a super normal dude. First of all, Charlie, thank you for listening. I'm sorry that this you're experiencing now is very not full cast, and I hope that's okay. But like, there is no normal full cast listener. That's kind of the nice thing about it, is that, you know, we get people who love college football, watch it all the time, super into it. We get people who are like, this is the only form of college football I engage with, is this show. So whatever it is that people like about it, I'm glad that they do.
Yeah, I think we're the same in a lot of ways with this podcast. I mean, we market to such a niche a niche group of people. It's hard to say we really do this for anything but our own personal enjoyment. I mean, we just like to do it. We like having people to talk about books with one another. That's been something we've always done. So being in high school, talking about doing this, to actually doing it, it's just a way, we get to keep in contact. I mean, we do outside of this, but it's just something we get to share, have a good time, do some fun, have some fun, read some
I think
books.
that's great. I mean, I have said this for a long time, and I've said it in part of, doing podcasts as this project or whatever, but like, you can fake so many things on the internet, especially in the sports internet. You can fake knowledge, you can go pull stats, you can like, there's a lot of things that you can sort of like fake your way through. Enthusiasm is not one of them. Like, ultimately, that is what is behind all of the work at Secret Base, is that these are all stories that for years we just would like go bug each other at our laptops about, or just like drop in Slack and be like, hey, like, did you see this? Have you ever seen this like crazy thing that happened in this game, or this like super weird season that this team had, or whatever? And all we did was we started making them into videos instead. Like, the real boring foundation of Secret Base as a creative enterprise is like, what if you made videos that you wanted to share with your friends instead of the videos that you think a sports media company is supposed to make? And that's it.
Yeah, we differ pretty substantially at that point, where we don't really make. we don't really
you two are the friends. You
exactly.
Yeah, we were just talking about that, like how it's like our viewer is him, and then like the views that aren't him are me.
But I like, I don't know it. We live in an internet world that is so much like everything has to be a side hustle, and if you're not monetizing these things, and like, I'm going to show my age here, but like in the late 90s, early 2000s internet, everybody was just doing it as a frickin' goof. Like, none of this was like, oh, I have a big plan and I'm going to be an influencer. It was just like, no, I'm starting a weird blog just because I feel like being weird online. And that was literally the only reason you needed. And it just happened to be that, like, some of these things bubbled up and became viable businesses. But, like, I don't think any of these endeavors should start from Like, I have a real hard time starting from the standpoint of, like, all right, how are we going to make some money being creative online? It's like, why don't we just be creative and then figure the rest out?
Yeah, I think we're like $80 in the hole, and I can't imagine we're gonna recover it. It's like
Let's see if we can get you guys to break even. I believe in you.
Ryan, before we let you go, to sort of bring it back to the literature aspect, we ask each other this question quite a bit. We ask a lot of our guests. I'm not sure why we adopted this voice for it, but it's like what you reading? Like what? Like I don't know. We have a series called Recent Reads that we sort of pull off of, and I guess the question's just what are you reading? You got any books or newspapers or anything that you've been following?
Yes, I am reading a novel right now called The Witches of Vardo. Or no, it's called The Mercies. The Witches of Vardo is a different version, is a different thing. This is called The Mercies. They're about the same subject. It's historical fiction about a small group of Norwegian women who, I think in the 17th century, all their husbands and sons went out fishing on Christmas Eve. There was a storm or a whale or something bad happened, and they all died. And so they were left to their own devices as a village of only women at a time when that kind of thing didn't exist. They managed to survive and thrive, and that turned into, historically, eventually witch trials were held there. This is a fictional account of the thing, but it's been a very enjoyable read. I haven't gotten to the part where accusations of witchcraft start getting thrown around, but I feel like I'm getting closer to it.
That's always exciting. You feel like you're just creeping up on that point where it's going to take a turn.
Yes.
Especially with historical fiction like that, where you know something bad's going to happen.
Yes.
I'm just not sure when and to who.
Yes, but the nice thing about it being historical fiction is, like, I can go look at the Wikipedia for the actual, like, Vardo witch trials that happened. I don't know that the book's going to go that way. The book has the license and the freedom, especially, I think, with something that, like, to me, when I got this book, I didn't even know it was based on anything true. I just thought it was a particularly creative conceit.
That's really interesting. We have yet to do historical fiction, except, do you consider Kindred historical fiction?
I think it could, like, historical fiction / like sci-fi.
Yeah. Kindred by Octavia Butler is really strange in that it's a bit historical fiction-y, a bit sci-fi, a little bit of fantasy, and then there's like contemporary, like the parallels between the police state and the antebellum South and stuff. Mm-hmm. Or like with that one, I feel you in that I have no idea where that book was going to go, and that creative license of the time where it's like, I've got no idea what they could possibly throw into this time period that I already, that I don't already know about because of my history class. So I really like that. I like that, like the unpredictability of that.
Yeah.
I appreciate the recommendation.
Sure.
And thank you for coming on. This has been Ryan Nanni. He is the former managing editor of Secret Base. And please check out his podcast, The Shutdown Fullcast. I know I'm going to be listening to it so I can talk to Charlie about it after his commute.
You're going to be very confused, just so you know.
And, thanks again.
Yeah, absolutely. This
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm Spice.
I'm Boom. He's Brian, and thanks for listening.